Moses' story begins during one of the darkest periods for the Hebrew people in Egypt. Under the rule of a new Pharaoh, who knew nothing of Joseph's contributions, the Hebrews were subjected to harsh slavery. Pharaoh, alarmed by the Hebrews' growing numbers, ordered that all newborn male Hebrew children be killed to weaken the population and prevent an uprising. In the midst of this oppression, Moses was born. His mother, Jochebed, recognized that her child was special and, with great courage, decided to hide him for 3 months, defying Pharaoh's orders. When she could no longer conceal him, she placed him in a basket of reeds and set it afloat on the Nile River, trusting God for his fate. Miraculously, the basket carrying Moses was found by Pharaoh's daughter. She took pity on the crying child and, despite knowing he was Hebrew, decided to adopt him as her own. Moses' sister, Miriam, who had followed the basket, cleverly suggested that a Hebrew nurse care for the child. Without knowing, Pharaoh's daughter entrusted Moses back into the arms of his own mother, allowing Jochebed to nurse and raise him for the first years of his life. This chapter of Moses' life reveals God's protection over him from the very beginning and sets the stage for his future role as the leader who would deliver his people from bondage. Moses grew up surrounded by the luxuries and power of the Egyptian court, educated by the best teachers and prepared for a prominent role in the kingdom. As the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, Moses had privileges beyond imagination. Yet, despite being raised as a prince, he never forgot his Hebrew roots. Moses witnessed the suffering of his people under the yoke of slavery. Though he lived in comfort, the sight of the Hebrews' daily struggles stirred a deep conflict within him. He was torn between the life of an Egyptian prince and the knowledge that he was one of the oppressed. This internal struggle reached a climax when Moses saw an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave. In a moment of anger and justice, he killed the overseer, choosing to stand with his people. This act put his life at risk, and Moses, knowing Pharaoh would seek his death, fled Egypt. This chapter marks Moses' transition from prince to fugitive, setting him on a path toward a greater calling, though he could not yet see it. After fleeing Egypt, Moses journeyed through the desert to the distant land of Midian. Exhausted and exiled, he arrived at a well where he encountered the daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian. When local shepherds harassed the women, Moses intervened and defended them, earning their gratitude. The women brought Moses to their father, Jethro, who welcomed him into his family. Moses soon married one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah, and settled into a new life as a shepherd, far removed from the grandeur of Egypt. Moses spent 40 years in Midian, living a humble and quiet life. During this time, he learned patience, humility, and leadership through tending flocks. Unbeknownst to him, God was preparing him for a much larger mission. This period in the wilderness was essential for Moses' personal growth and spiritual preparation, setting the stage for the next chapter of his divine calling. Moses' peaceful life in Midian was interrupted one day when he saw a bush burning, yet it was not consumed by the flames. Approaching the bush, Moses heard the voice of God calling him by name. God revealed to Moses that he had heard the cries of the Israelites in Egypt and chosen him to lead them out of slavery. This was the turning point in Moses' life, a call to become the deliverer of Israel. Though Moses felt unworthy and questioned his ability to confront Pharaoh, God reassured him with signs and wonders. God also appointed Moses' brother Aaron as his spokesman to assist him. This chapter marks the divine commissioning of Moses, transforming him from a shepherd into the chosen leader of God's people. With his mission clear, Moses returned to Egypt to confront Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world. Together with Aaron, he delivered God's message, "Let my people go." Pharaoh, however, scoffed at the demand, refusing to recognize the God of Israel and increasing the burden on the Hebrew slaves. Thus began a series of divine judgments, plagues that devastated Egypt. From the Nile turning to blood to frogs, lice, flies, disease, hail, locusts, and darkness. Each plague demonstrated God's power. Yet, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Finally, the 10th and most devastating plague came: the death of every firstborn in Egypt. The Israelites were instructed to mark their doors with the blood of a lamb so the angel of death would pass over their homes. This marked the first Passover. Struck by the loss of his own son, Pharaoh relented and allowed the Israelites to leave Egypt. The liberation had finally come, and Moses led the people out of bondage. As the Israelites left Egypt, Pharaoh, once again hardened, sent his army to recapture them. Trapped between the Red Sea and the pursuing Egyptians, the people panicked. Moses, however, stood firm, proclaiming, "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the deliverance the Lord will bring today." In one of the most iconic miracles, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the waters parted, creating a dry path for the Israelites to cross. Once they reached the other side, the sea closed over Pharaoh's army, destroying them completely. This chapter marks the final act of liberation for the Israelites and establishes Moses as a leader of unparalleled faith and trust in God. With the Red Sea behind them, the Israelites embarked on a long and difficult journey through the desert. Though they were free from slavery, their faith was constantly tested. Lacking food and water, the people frequently grumbled against Moses and God. In response, God provided for their needs. He sent manna from heaven daily and water from a rock when they were parched. Despite these miracles, the people's complaints and rebellion persisted, testing Moses' leadership and patience. This chapter highlights the challenges of leading a large, often ungrateful people, as well as God's continual provision and guidance through the desert. After months of wandering, the Israelites reached Mount Sinai, where God established a formal covenant with them. Moses ascended the mountain and spent 40 days in God's presence, receiving the 10 Commandments and the law that would guide Israel. Meanwhile, the people below grew restless and, in Moses' absence, crafted a golden calf to worship. This act of idolatry angered both Moses and God. After interceding for the people, Moses returned to the mountain to renew the covenant and receive a second set of tablets. The giving of the law at Sinai was a defining moment in Israel's history, marking them as God's chosen people with a clear code to live by. Despite the covenant and numerous miracles, the Israelites continued to rebel. One of the most significant rebellions came from Korah and his followers, who challenged Moses and Aaron's authority. God responded decisively, opening the earth to swallow the rebels and reaffirming Moses' leadership. At other times, the people complained about a lack of water and food. In one instance, Moses disobeyed God by striking a rock instead of speaking to it, which resulted in water flowing but ultimately led to God's decree that Moses would not enter the promised land. This chapter illustrates the ongoing struggle between faith and rebellion and the consequences of disobedience, even for a leader like Moses. As the Israelites neared the promised land, God reminded Moses that he would not enter it due to his disobedience. However, Moses' leadership was not yet complete. He climbed Mount Nebo, from where he could see the entire land of Canaan, and blessed the people one last time. Moses appointed Joshua as his successor, passing on the leadership with the assurance that God would be with him just as he had been with Moses. Moses died at the age of 120, and God himself buried him in an unknown location. The Israelites mourned for 30 days, recognizing that there would never be another prophet like Moses, whom God knew face to face. This final chapter concludes the life of Moses, but his legacy lived on in the people he had led, and the laws he had delivered, shaping the future of Israel for generations.